And good afternoon and welcome. This is episode 61 of Thursdays with Charlie, the 22nd of July, 2021. Well, masses are going well back at the Riverside. We're very glad to be back there, and the crowds are starting to increase. Please spread the word that we are there for the 4 p.m. Mass on Saturdays, the 10 a.m. and the 12 noon Masses on Sundays, and they're all in Don's Celebrity Theater at the Riverside. Masses at church on the weekends remain the 6 p.m. on Saturday night and the 8 a.m. on Sunday morning. Again, please spread that word. We had a few people this weekend who went to the wrong places for the Masses, so we're trying to get that coordinated again. I'd like to talk a little bit today about saints, only because we have a couple of important ones, well-known ones, that are coming up this week. For instance, today, the 22nd of July, we celebrate the feast day of St. Mary Magdalene. Now, you might be familiar with that name very much from the scriptures. It occurs at least a dozen times in the Gospels, Mary Magdalene, but there seems to be a conflation of several people that shared the name Mary, and they all kind of conflate into the one person. And so you have Mary, the sister of Martha and Mary, that story of those two. And Martha was the one who was working so hard at household things, and Mary was the one who went and sat at the feet of Jesus to listen to him. We have that Mary. We have Mary, the penitent sinner, who comes to Jesus and who weeps so much that she washes Jesus' feet with her tears and she dries them with her hair. We have that Mary. We have Mary who's present at the crucifixion of Jesus and who is a witness immediately after the resurrection of Jesus. We have that Mary as well. Somehow in the church's thinking and tradition, they all kind of get conflated, even though scholars say they're probably different people. And so Mary Magdalene takes in the conflation of all these women. And you can see that conflation. Every saint is pretty much assigned or falls into a category as being the patron saint of certain things. And so Mary Magdalene over the centuries has picked up several things that she's the patron saint of. She's the patron saint of contemplative life. Well, that would go back to Mary, who with her sister Martha. Martha was working hard. Mary sat at the feet of Jesus and listened. But she's also the patron saint of converts. And that would go back to the idea of sinners coming back to Jesus. She's the patron saint of glove makers. That probably goes with the idea that Mary was a woman of the world. She's the patron saint of hairdressers. That goes back to the story of drying Jesus' feet with her hair. She's the patron saint of perfume makers. Probably, again, the idea of Mary perhaps leading a life that was very worldly. She's the patron saint of people who are ridiculed for their piety, that they have practices, religious practices, that other people don't understand, and people question that. Again, that goes back to the story of Martha and Mary. She's the patron saint of pharmacists. I have no idea why that one comes in, but it's there. She's the patron saint against sexual temptation. That goes into the idea of Mary being a woman of the world. She's the patron saint of tanners. I have no idea why that one comes in, those who take care of making animal hides usable. And she's one of the many patron saints for women in the world, one that they can look up to. All of us can look up to Mary Magdalene, no matter what the conflation, as being a great example of someone who has received God's mercy throughout her life. As I mentioned, she's mentioned at least a dozen times in the Gospels and the four Gospels. She was probably the real Mary Magdalene. Maybe she wasn't that woman who was the great sinner who came to Jesus. Maybe she wasn't the great sinner who wept at his feet and dried his hair. But there's Marys are all kind of conflated into her. She was definitely a follower of Jesus. She shows up at various points, and very importantly, she's present at the crucifixion of Jesus. She's there standing with Mary, the mother of Jesus. Mary Magdalene was present for that. And in Matthew's Gospel, Mary Magdalene is the first one to receive news of the resurrection. She's at the tomb of Jesus, and she sees what she thinks is the gardener, and she asks where the body of Jesus is, and the gardener calls her by name, Mary, and she recognizes that it's Jesus. There's an interesting legend that at the end of her life, after she had been a very faithful disciple to Jesus, after the resurrection, again staying with the apostles and bringing the new church into being, really, there's a story that she was set adrift in a boat by people who were against her and some other converts to Christianity, and they were put adrift in the Mediterranean Sea, and somehow the boat ended up at the south of France. And so the legend has it that that's where Mary Magdalene lived out the rest of her days as a Christian example, one of the earliest Christians in the south of France. And she's revered there for having brought the faith to southern France. Second saint is one that's been very much misunderstood over the years, but really interesting and popular. And on July 25th, this Sunday, we celebrate the feast of Saint Christopher. There's all sorts of things about Christopher that we know. Well, Christopher, we consider his feast day to be July 25th, and he's the patron saint of many, many things. Perhaps the most famous in our mind is the patron saint of motorists, of driving in cars. But he's also the patron saint of bachelors, a single man growing up in the world, of all forms of transportation. He's one of the patron saints there. He's patron saint of all forms of traveling. And a patron saint to pray to against storms and against epilepsy. Again, I don't know why those all crept in. Patron saint of gardeners, and the patron saint, one of the patron saints of a holy death, Saint Joseph being the primary saint of a holy death. And for some strange reason, Christopher is also known as the patron saint against toothaches. Not sure how that one came in. What we do seem to know about him is that he has been regarded since the earliest centuries of the church as a martyr. He died for the faith and died under one of the Roman emperors, and the year is given as 251. But we really know very little about him factually. We know there are stories about his life, but there's not a lot of corroboration or consistency with the stories. One of the most beautiful stories, and the one that I like to revert back to, is that Christopher was really, really tall, that he was almost in the realm of gigantically tall. And he had a desire from a young age that he wanted to serve the greatest king in the world, the greatest king. And so he began by trying to serve, to be in the service of the king of his particular area. But he noticed one day that the king, when confronted by somebody who mentioned the devil, made the sign of the cross really quickly, as though he were afraid of the devil. And so Christopher in this legend said, well, the king then is not the greatest king on the earth. It must be the devil, because the king is afraid of him. And so he decides he wants to go and serve the devil. Well, he actually, in the legend, finds a band of thieves in the area whose leader called himself the devil. And so Christopher enlists to go work with this band of thieves. But then he noticed that later on, this man who called himself the devil, someone held up a crucifix to him, and he shunned away from it. So that the man who said he was the devil was afraid of the cross. And so Christopher said, well, then I don't want to serve him. I want to serve the one who's on the cross. And he happened to meet up with a hermit, a man who lived on his own in the service of Jesus. And this hermit, legend says his name was Fabulous. This hermit taught Christopher about Jesus. And then he said, well, since he's not here on earth, how can I serve him? And the hermit recommended that Christopher look around and find something he could do that would be of service to the king's people here on earth. Well, there was a large river nearby, and since Christopher was very, very tall, he began to voluntarily take people across the river, that he would carry them or he would assist them to make it through the river. There was no bridge. And Christopher did that for many, many years. And one day he was there waiting on the side of the river, and according to the legend, a child approaches him and asks to be helped across the river. And since it was a child, Christopher put the child on his shoulders and carried him across the river. But Christopher noticed as he was walking across the river that the child got heavier and heavier and heavier until Christopher was almost bowed down into the water from the weight of the child. And he puts the child down on the other side and says, why were you so heavy? And the child explains, because the child was Jesus, and he was carrying the weight of the world. And Christopher had carried the weight of the world by carrying Jesus across the river. That's one of the reasons why Christopher is regarded as the patron saint of those who are traveling, going from one place to another. And certainly with the arrival of the automobile in the 20th century, Christopher began to be regarded as a preeminent saint for motorists. So many people have a St. Christopher medal in their car or in their camper or on their bike or on their motorcycle, whatever. Now, you might have heard a few years ago, there was a whole ruckus that Christopher is no longer a saint. Well, that's not true. During the pontificate of Pope Paul VI, right after the Vatican Council in the 1960s, there was an effort to go through the calendar of saints and try to figure out which ones were deserving, if you will, of being honored by the universal church everywhere in the world. And it was felt that since there were so many saints, that maybe we should just restrict the ones that are being honored universally to saints that we know a lot more about historically. And there was very little historical information about Christopher other than a date of death. And even his name is somewhat mysterious, because he's named Christopher, and yet what he does in life is he carries Christ. And Christopher is translated as the bearer of Christ, someone who carries Christ. And so in the time of Paul VI, the end of the 1960s, it was decided that Christopher should be reserved for local veneration. So churches named for St. Christopher obviously would continue that. Medals made for St. Christopher obviously could continue to be borne. But it was felt that there's so little known about him that to spread devotion over the universal church was probably not going to be continued. And so his feast day of the 25th of July is kind of reserved to churches of his name, areas where he's been particularly revered. But we do know that, he was a martyr. Date of death is probably in 251, probably died in or around the area of Rome. Which brings us to the last two saints that I want to talk about, and their feast day is on the 26th of July, so this coming Monday, and that's Saints Joachim and Anne. Joachim and Anne are honored as the parents of Mary and the grandparents of Jesus. Now, when we talk about knowing little about people's lives, there's nothing in the scriptures about Joachim and Anne. Main information we get about them is found in an apocryphal gospel called the Gospel of James. Even scholars don't regard it as having been written by James the Apostle, but very likely it was written early on in the church's history by someone claiming that name or sharing that name for whatever reason. It was a common name. But it's in the Gospel of James that we find the names Joachim and Anne. And they're the parents of Mary, the Blessed Virgin Mary, the mother of Jesus. So they are the grandparents of Jesus. So their feast day on the 26th of July could be regarded as the earliest version of a grandparents' day. It's kind of a beautiful thing. And there are many stories about Joachim and Anne, but one of my favorite ones is that they were an elderly couple. They were well past the age of having children, and they had not had children. And they lived in Jerusalem, and they prayed about it, and they begged God to send them a child. And it seemed that God wasn't responding to their prayers. And so Joachim goes off into the desert to pray privately on his own, maybe for a period of days, to go off and be away, just praying and seeking this grace from God. And back home, Anne, according to the legend, vows that she's going to pray to be given the gift of having a child. And according to the story, both of them are praying in separate places, and an angel of the Lord, most likely Gabriel, because Gabriel seems to be the angel that was sent whenever God wished to convey a message, particularly about a birth. The angel Gabriel, or an angel, came to the two of them separately and informed them that, yes, they would have a child, and that it would be a child that would be known throughout the world. This was the prediction, if you will, of the birth of the Blessed Virgin Mary. And after the angel appeared, Joachim was so glad that he hurried back. He raced back as fast as he could run from the desert to get back to his beloved wife to tell her. And meanwhile, Anne was trying to race out to get to the desert to find Joachim to tell him that she had seen the angel. And the two of them met under what is called the Golden Gate of Jerusalem. It's the easternmost gate of the city of Jerusalem, facing out onto the desert. And according to the legend, which is the most beautiful part of it, I think, the two of them run into each other and they embrace and kiss under the Golden Gate of the city of Jerusalem, both telling one another that they had seen the angel and that they're going to have a child. And that child grows up to be the Blessed Virgin Mary, the wife of Joseph, and they become the mother of Jesus, and so the grandparents of Jesus. Joachim and Anne are regarded as the patron saint of grandparents. They're also one of the patron saints of the elderly. Now, as I was thinking of their feast day, when we sent out our letter to everybody in June, we sent out a prayer card for the feast day of Joachim and Anne. I know there are going to be people at our masses this weekend who didn't receive the prayer card, who might like an additional one. So these will be available for you just to pick up at the church and at the Riverside as well. Prayer card to Saints Joachim and Anne to honor grandparents. You might want to pick one up and use that prayer. And since we were thinking about grandparents, I decided I'm going to go look through, and I found a picture. The amazing thing with this picture to me is it's the only picture I could find of my four grandparents, my mother's parents and my father's parents, together in the same picture. And so I had a small 4x6 copy of it, and I decided I would treat myself and make an 8x10 of these grandparents. Now, I have no idea when this picture was taken. My grandparents lived in two different states. My mother's family lived in Kearney, New Jersey. My father's family lived in Oyster Bay, New York. But my mother's father, my grandfather Anthony, died in 1959. So I would presume that this picture was taken probably in the mid-1950s. And I can recognize that it was taken in the dining room of the house where I grew up. So I'm going to suspect that they might have been there for a birthday party for me or for some family celebration. But it's the only picture I have of the four of them together. And it's interesting, I was looking at the picture and I'm thinking, well, my mother's father, Anthony Johnson, lived in Kearney. He ran a grocery store, and I used to go down and help out in the store when I could. And sometimes they'd let me stock the shelves, and sometimes they'd let me actually work the cash register, which I kind of enjoyed. My grandfather's biggest fear, though, was that, oh my gosh, he's going to cut his fingers off on the meat slicer. So they were very careful about not letting me near that, except if I absolutely had to be slicing cold cuts or something like that. My grandfather's wife, my grandmother, my mother's mother, was named Helen, and Helen lived in a house which connected right to the grocery store. I can remember we'd be there for dinner and they'd be missing something at the table, and my grandmother would walk right out into the store and bring it back, and we'd have it, whether it was mayonnaise or some dressing or some vegetable or something. It was really a nice thing. I always enjoyed going over to my grandparents' store. My father's parents were Tekla, my grandmother's name, very unusual, and Charles Ernick, and they lived in Oyster Bay, New York. My grandmother actually worked as a maid on the estate of Teddy Roosevelt, Sagamore Hill, in Oyster Bay, New York. I'm not sure what my grandfather on my father's side did. He was not working when I was born. All of my grandparents were born in the 1890s, and so they were all kind of elderly by the time I came along in the late 1940s to meet with them. And they all started. My grandfather on my mother's side was the first to die in 1959. My grandmother on my father's side was the last to die in 1977. But I love looking at that picture and seeing them and thinking of them, and it was really nice to be there. One of the stories that always I think of when I think of my grandparents, my mother was one of 3 children, and I had 2 aunts on my mother's side, my Aunt Helen and my Aunt Lillian, my Aunt Lil. And Lil had a reputation of being very, very talkative. And Lil was thrilled that I wanted to become a priest. And she lived in North Carolina. And my Aunt Lil always felt that I should be a priest in North Carolina. And every time I would go down to visit her when I was in the seminary, she would remind me of this. And she would somehow manage to invite somebody from the diocese. Please come over and have dinner. My nephew's going to be here. And one guy came over, and he was the vocation director for the Diocese of Raleigh, North Carolina, and he actually brought paperwork with him for me to sign to transfer to the Diocese of Raleigh. My aunt had tried to engineer that. I didn't sign it, and I stayed with Newark, and obviously I'm out here now. But my aunt talked. He was probably the most talkative person that I knew, especially about me. She was very proud that I was going to become a priest. And I know this because years later, I happened to run into her parish pastor. He was visiting up in New Jersey, and I happened to meet him at a parish, and they said, oh, Father Tate from Our Lady of Lourdes Parish in Raleigh is visiting one of the parishioners here. And I said, Father Tate from Raleigh? That's my aunt's parish. And I ran into the sacristy, and I said, Father Tate, I've never met you, but I'm Charlie Ernick. I said, I'm, and I never got out any further than and he looked at me and said, you're the nephew. Your aunt has never had an unspoken thought in her life. And that's how we met. But one of the things my aunt said, my aunt had 2 children, and after they grew up and they had children, my Aunt Lil's comment was, if I would have known grandchildren were this much fun, I would have had them first. I've always liked that quote by my aunt. She was a very, very happy grandmother. If I would have known grandchildren were this much fun, I would have had them first. Well, it's time for our Pascal to come on down. You'll find some more quotes about grandparents in our bulletin this week, including my aunt's quote. And Pascal brings us something. Since we mentioned several saints today, I thought it would be good for us to include in our prayers, Omnes Sancti et Sanctae Dei ora pro nobis. All you holy men and women, saints of God, pray for us. The invocation of the saints is very important in our Catholic prayer life, and I'm glad I could share with you some of the stories of the lives of the saints. God bless you and have a wonderful week.